Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Alexander Ward stood by the vast window of his glass-walled penthouse, the skyline of London glittering like a cage of diamonds. Success had given him everything: power, headlines, and a net worth too large to spend in a lifetime. Yet the silence of his apartment pressed heavier than marble. The laughter of his girlfriend Harper Lane echoed from another room, rehearsing lines for her latest influencer ad. His assistant Sophie Grant typed endlessly, never smiling unless there was a contract to win. And somewhere down the hallway, Grace Miller polished silver trays, as if the shine could hide her fatigue. Alexander's mind spun with doubt. Did anyone in his orbit care for him, or only for what he could give? He turned from the glass, a small, bitter smile curving his lips. People always claimed they were different, yet the moment wealth entered the picture, sincerity vanished. That night, a strange idea rooted itself in his mind, a social experiment disguised as generosity. He would test them: the woman who claimed to love him, the assistant who claimed loyalty, and the maid who never claimed anything at all. The credit card lay on the desk, black and gleaming like temptation itself. Alexander whispered, "Let's see who you really are." The next morning, Harper, Sophie, and Grace were summoned to the living room terrace, where sunlight poured over polished stone. Alexander appeared in casual clothes, uncharacteristically relaxed, holding a single card between his fingers. "I'm traveling for 3 days," he said evenly. "Each of you may use this card while I'm away. No limits. Spend however you wish." The words struck the women differently. Harper's eyes glittered with disbelief. Sophie blinked in measured curiosity, and Grace looked instantly uneasy, as if holding such power would be sinful. When Alexander left, Harper squealed in delight, proclaiming it a reward for loyalty. Sophie hid her entry behind professional restraint. Grace murmured a quiet "thank you," thinking mostly about how dangerous a billionaire's card could be in her callous hands. As the elevator doors closed behind him, all 3 women were left staring at that symbol of endless choice. None of them knew Alexander had hidden cameras and trackers on every transaction. The test had begun, not of wealth, but of soul. Within hours, Harper Lane unleashed the full spectacle of her desires. Designer boutiques on Bond Street became her playground. She filmed every purchase, every champagne sip, every luxury fitting, posting to millions of followers with captions like, "When your man treats you right." Her reflection in each mirror fed her ego like nectar. She convinced herself she deserved it all. Wasn't she the face beside Alexander at every gala? Didn't she endure the loneliness of dating a man who lived for business? But deep down, under the shimmer of sequins, a whisper of guilt tried to surface. She drowned it in laughter and a yacht party that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Surrounded by fake friends and shallow compliments, Harper never noticed that her spree was being logged in real time by Alexander's analyst software. He watched quietly from his private jet, the first hint of disappointment curdling in his chest. Sophie Grant didn't rush to Selfridges or Harrods. She went to her office, locked the door, and opened her laptop. The card was a weapon, and she intended to use it surgically. Through a maze of online transactions, she booked first-class tickets to Monaco, reserved seats at executive dinners, and purchased high-end gadgets and gifts not for pleasure, but leverage. Her mind hummed with calculation. This was her chance to build a network independent of Alexander Ward, to present herself as an equal to the men who envied her employer. She justified it as professionalism, yet as she looked at the confirmation emails piling up, she couldn't ignore the exhilaration of betrayal. For years she'd worked beneath Alexander's shadow. Now she could shine without him. The irony was perfect, using his wealth to escape him. She smiled thinly, whispering, "Power is about timing, not permission." Somewhere above the clouds, Alexander studied her transactions and realized loyalty could wear a very convincing mask. Grace Miller sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone out. The black credit card lay untouched before her, glinting under fluorescent light. She had never held such power. She didn't even have a personal bank card without limits. But something inside resisted. What could she possibly need that would justify spending a billionaire's fortune? The thought alone made her uncomfortable. She called her mother that night, asking, "Mom, if someone gave you everything, would you take it?" Her mother laughed softly. "Only if it helps someone else, love." Grace smiled. The next day, she took the car to the corner market, not for herself, but for others. She filled carts with groceries, clothing, and medical supplies, quietly delivering them to shelters and families she'd met through her church. Every purchase came with humility, not greed. While others might have flaunted receipts, Grace hid hers like secrets of kindness. Each transaction pinged Alexander's system, yet the numbers were small, the motive pure. Watching from afar, he frowned, not out of anger, but confusion. Why would someone so poor give so freely? 3 days later, Alexander returned to London. His penthouse looked unchanged, but he could feel the shift in the air, like a room that had heard confessions. Harper burst into his arms, draped in designer silk, smelling of perfume and champagne. "You won't believe what I planned for us," she exclaimed, flashing diamond bracelets. Sophie handed him a neat portfolio, detailing strategic investments made on his behalf. Grace simply greeted him with a polite smile and a tray of tea, eyes lowered. That night, alone in his study, Alexander reviewed the footage and transactions. Harper's feed was filled with excess. Sophie's expenditures reeked of opportunism, and Grace's records read like a charity report. His throat tightened. The test had revealed what he feared. Love and loyalty were for sale everywhere except where he least expected. He poured a glass of whiskey and whispered, "Grace Miller, what are you made of?" The following morning, Alexander called all 3 women into the drawing room. The atmosphere was electric. "I know what each of you did," he began calmly. Harper blinked, laughing nervously. "Oh, come on, darling. You said anything goes." Sophie stiffened, already anticipating damage control. Grace clutched her apron, eyes wide with worry. Alexander projected the receipts onto the screen behind him. Numbers, images, videos. Gasps filled the room as the truth unfolded like a verdict. "Harper," he said quietly, "you spent enough to feed an entire village." She scoffed. "That's rich coming from a man who owns 10 villas." "Sophie," he continued, "you used my trust to broker deals with my rivals." She looked away, face tight with shame and pride intermingled. Finally, he turned to Grace. "And you spent the least, yet gave the most." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean to offend you, sir. I just thought others needed it more." Silence swallowed the room. For the first time, Alexander felt something real pierce his chest. Harper stormed out first, muttering that she didn't sign up for reality TV. Sophie followed, head high but eyes trembling, her career disintegrating with each step. The echo of their heels faded, leaving only Grace and Alexander in the vast quiet. She looked ready to apologize again, but he stopped her. "Don't," he said softly. "You're the only one who passed a test you didn't even know existed." Grace hesitated, unsure whether it was kindness or pity she was hearing. Alexander's gaze lingered, admiration tinged with guilt. How had he let the most honest soul in his world clean his floors? As she left to resume her duties, he sat back, the emptiness in his chest shifting into something unfamiliar: respect. For the first time in years, Alexander Ward didn't feel superior. He felt humbled. Days passed. Harper vanished into her influencer bubble. Sophie submitted a resignation letter with cold efficiency. Yet Grace remained quiet, steady, refusing to treat him differently. Alexander began to notice details he had ignored before. How she hummed softly while tidying, how she greeted security guard by name, how her laughter lightened the air. One evening, he found her outside feeding stray cats behind a mansion, the same way she'd fed strangers with his money. He asked, "Why do you care so much for people who can't repay you?" Grace smiled faintly. "Because kindness shouldn't come with an invoice." The words lodged in his heart like poetry. That night he couldn't sleep. He scrolled through photos of his empire, buildings, cars, trophies, and realized none of them had ever made him feel alive. Grace Miller, a woman with nothing, had given him the rarest luxury of all: sincerity. Alexander invited Grace to breakfast in the garden, a first in their years of working together. Nervously, she sat opposite him, unsure if she was being dismissed or rewarded. He slid the credit card across the table again, but this time it came with a handwritten note. "Use this not to spend, but to dream. What would you build if money wasn't a limit?" Grace looked up, startled. "Sir, I don't need anything." He shook his head. "Maybe not for yourself, but perhaps for others." Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "There's an orphanage near Brixton. Their roof leaks every time it rains." Alexander smiled, the first genuine one she'd ever seen. "Then start there. At that moment, the billionaire who once measured worth in pounds began to measure it in purpose. Grace's humility had cracked open his world, and through that fracture, light poured in. The following weeks saw quiet miracles unfold around London. Grace, with Alexander's silent backing, oversaw the repair of the orphanage's leaking roof. She bought new books, mattresses, and food supplies, yet she refused to take public credit. She signed every receipt anonymously. The children's laughter echoed through the newly painted halls, carrying a joy money alone could never buy. Alexander often visited discreetly, watching from his car as Grace worked tirelessly alongside volunteers. Something inside him stirred, a warmth that no business triumph had ever produced. He began to question everything he'd built. The skyscrapers bearing his name suddenly felt hollow. The luxury cars seemed absurd. In Grace's simplicity, he saw integrity, the kind his billion-pound empire had never taught him. At night, he found himself replaying her words. Kindness shouldn't come with an invoice. The sentence haunted and healed him all at once. For the first time, Alexander Ward desired not admiration, but meaning. One afternoon, Grace found Alexander at the orphanage gates, dressed simply, no entourage or guards. He looked oddly at peace among the children tugging at his sleeves. You shouldn't be here without security, she said, half laughing. He replied, I think I'm safer here than in any boardroom. He spent the day painting walls, carrying boxes, and serving meals under her guidance. The billionaire who once judged people by numbers now took instructions from Maid and loved every second of it. As dusk approached, they sat on the orphanage steps, covered in paint. Why didn't you tell me you were funding this? She asked. He smiled faintly. Because you were already doing it right. I just followed your lead. Their eyes met in the amber glow of evening, and for the first time, Grace saw not her employer, but a man capable of change. Something fragile bloomed between them, a connection built not on wealth, but shared purpose. Word began to spread that Alexander Ward was acting strange. His board members whispered. His ex-girlfriend Harper went live on social media accusing him of losing his edge, and Sophie, now employed by a rival firm, fed rumors to tabloids about an unhealthy attachment to a maid. The story went viral. London billionaire falls for his housemaid. Grace's quiet world was suddenly invaded by paparazzi. She felt exposed and humiliated, begging Alexander to let her quit. But Alexander refused. If you leave because they mock you, they win, he said firmly. You taught me that decency is louder than scandal. Grace hesitated, torn between fear and loyalty. Despite the media frenzy, she continued her charitable work, her courage reminding him that leadership wasn't about control, it was about conviction. And though the world sneered, he realized he'd rather stand beside Grace in truth than beside society in hypocrisy. The backlash intensified. Shareholders demanded explanations. Tabloids printed lies about Grace's hidden motives, and protesters appeared outside Ward Enterprises, chanting about class betrayal. For the first time in years, Alexander's empire trembled, not from competition, but conscience. His PR team begged him to issue a statement denying personal involvement with his maid. Instead, he called a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stood before the world, unflinching. I gave 3 women a credit card, he began, his voice steady. Only one spent it wisely, not for gain, but for good. Her name is Grace Miller, and she taught me more about humanity than any of my mentors. The hall fell silent. If kindness is weakness, then I intend to be weak for the rest of my life. That declaration changed everything. Some mocked him, others applauded. But for Alexander, the decision was freedom itself. Grace watched the broadcast from her small flat, tears streaming down her cheeks. She never wanted recognition, yet here he was, defending her before millions. When she returned to the mansion, the staff stared in awe. She found Alexander in the garden, exhausted but serene. Why would you risk everything for me? She asked quietly. He smiled. Because you reminded me I still had a heart worth risking. Their conversation stretched into the night. Grace confessed her fears of public shame. Alexander confessed his loneliness. For the first time, he spoke not as her employer, but as a man humbled by love. I don't need a partner who dazzles the world, he whispered. I need one who sees through it. Grace said nothing, but her silence carried the weight of affection that words could never hold. Weeks later, Alexander called Grace to his office, not as staff, but as a partner. The new venture proposal read, the Ward Foundation for Human Dignity. It would fund shelters, free schools, and hospitals across the UK and Africa. You'll co-chair it, he said. Grace nearly dropped the document. Sir, I'm not qualified for this. He smiled warmly. You're the only one who is. Her compassion, discipline, and humility had already proven her leadership. Together, they began to build something extraordinary. While Alexander managed funding, Grace shaped the human side, programs for widows, orphan children, and low-income families. Their partnership blossomed into mutual respect and quiet affection. The world that once mocked now watched in awe. Even critics began to admit that perhaps kindness wasn't naivety. It was strength in its purest form. Months later, Harper reappeared, her career in ruins. She begged Alexander for a second chance, accusing Grace of manipulation. She's turned you into a charity project. Harper hissed. Alexander's expression remained unreadable. If that's true, he replied calmly, then she succeeded where wealth failed. Harper's eyes burned with regret as she stormed away. Meanwhile, Sophie tried to sabotage one of the Foundation's projects by leaking donor data to the press. But this time, Alexander and Grace faced the storm together. When questioned by reporters, Grace said only, "Forgiveness is cheaper than revenge." The statement went viral, not as scandal, but as inspiration. Donations doubled overnight. Harper disappeared again. Sophie resigned in disgrace, and Alexander realized that Grace's quiet resilience was his fortress. She had no armor of money or fame, only integrity, and that, he realized, was invincible. One evening, after a long day visiting schools they built, Alexander walked Grace to her car. The sky was violet with twilight, soft rain falling around them. He stopped her gently. "Grace," he began, "I don't know how to say this without sounding ungrateful, but you've changed me." She smiled shyly. "You changed yourself." He shook his head. "No, you showed me how." His voice softened. "I used to think wealth was power, but it's not. It's love. And I love you." Grace froze. Years of class difference, fear, and humility tangled in her chest. "You can't mean that," she whispered. "I'm your maid." He stepped closer. "You were never just my maid. You were my compass." For a moment, the rain seemed to hold its breath. Then Grace smiled faintly and whispered back, "Then let's find where this compass leads." Months later, the world witnessed a wedding unlike any London had seen. There were no royal guests or celebrity entourages, just children from the orphanage scattering rose petals, and a crowd of humble faces whose lives had been touched by the Foundation. Grace wore a simple white gown. Alexander, a modest suit. When they exchanged vows, reporters cried quietly, realizing they were watching a fairy tale rooted in reality. The headlines read, "From Maid to Philanthropist, the woman who rebuilt a billionaire's heart." Harper disappeared from tabloids. Sophie was forgotten. But Alexander and Grace never chased attention. Their love wasn't built for spectacle. It was built for legacy. And together, they transformed his empire from a monument of pride into a sanctuary of compassion. Years later, Alexander Ward's mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. Children's laughter filled the halls. Volunteers came and went, and Grace, now Lady Ward, worked tirelessly beside him. The credit card that once tested hearts now sat framed on his desk, engraved with the words, "Wealth means nothing without kindness." One evening, as the sun set over London, Alexander held Grace's hand on the balcony overlooking the city that once worshipped his wealth. "You know," he said softly, "I thought I'd build an empire, but you helped me build a home." Grace leaned against him, smiling, "And a heart worth keeping." The lights of London flickered below, but inside that penthouse, warmth glowed brighter, a final proof that the greatest fortune isn't found in what we own, but in what we give. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.